Good morning, Marina. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good, good. Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I've followed your work for a long while, so it's a privilege to have the chance to have a proper conversation. So, yeah, well, welcome to Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you.
And as you know, because I was very excited to hear that you've watched and listened to some of these interviews already, so you know the flow, but it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and what matters. And sentientism, I clearly have a bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really broad, pluralistic worldview called sentientism, which suggests that when it comes to thinking about what's real and how to believe, we should take a naturalistic approach. So we use evidence and reason to form our credences. And when it comes to what and who matters, the clue is in the name, that we should grant moral consideration or have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish or experience things. But I'm talking to people in these conversations, both who agree with that way of thinking and disagree with it. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and how your work fits into that. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for people who don't know you?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist. I focus on factory farming and animal agriculture, other kinds of animal exploitation, and the criminalization of activists, animal activists, which usually means DXE, but sometimes other groups as well. I have been, I've been deeply passionate about animal rights and veganism since I was very young, and we'll talk about that. But I would say that I've only pretty recently started to focus on it in my work. It took me most of my 20s to figure out that this is obviously what I'm destined to focus on. I think I was a little afraid of it before, or avoiding it. And I would, so I've covered a ton of different things in the past as a journalist. I wrote here and there sometimes about veganism and animals, but really only in the last several months I've been fully focusing on it, and it's been really great. I'm excited to continue with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition because I think for many people who are in the public eye, with their journalists or personalities or celebrities, they're thinking about ethics, whether it's animal ethics or other ethical topics, sometimes is something that you have to sort of keep to the side. It's a bit of a tangent. It may appear occasionally. So it's quite interesting to take that shift and say, now I'm going to make that the center of what I do. And you can see that, I guess, across the the celebrity world as well. There are some people for whom it's in the background, and some people have really made it, a front and center issue, unashamedly in their work. So it's quite a brave transition, I'd imagine, to make. But hope it feels good.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So let's come on to that first big question: what's real and what to believe? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in a family and society that was maybe more supernatural, religious, or mystical, or spiritual in some sense, or one that was more scientific, naturalistic, maybe atheist, agnostic, and how their thinking has changed over time, if it has, about epistemology and how and what to believe. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it would be fascinating to know your story on that side of philosophy.
Sure. Yeah. So I was raised by a single mom. We immigrated to the U.S. As part of when I was very little. I was not quite 4. We were Belarus. We were part of a wave of former Soviet Jewish refugees coming to the U.S. between the 70s and 90s. I grew up in St. Louis, which a lot of people who don't live in the US haven't necessarily heard of it or don't think much of it, but it's a pretty big city in the middle of the country. I wouldn't say my mom was particularly religious or philosophical. She didn't know the first thing about practicing Judaism, as I would say probably most Soviet Jews didn't. But she did put me in an Orthodox Jewish school, which I went to from preschool through 8th grade. So we would have it was basically a dual curriculum. We had, regular secular subjects and also Judaic studies. So because of that, I was raised in this pretty traditional, observant worldview. But because I was an outsider there, most of the kids there came from observant traditional Jewish families, and that my household wasn't that way at all. We didn't really do anything. So I think because I was an outsider there, I was pretty questioning of everything we were taught. I think I was like skeptical of the religious stuff from a pretty young age. For as long as I remember. I think I remember in middle school, or maybe it was early high school, I'm not sure. I made my religion on Facebook the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. That's not quite how I think about religion today, but
so you were a Pastafarian for a while.
Yeah. I don't remember how serious I was about that. I definitely had that phase.
And it's a tangent, but I have confirmed via the person who runs the Pastafarian account on Twitter that the meatballs in the pasta dish are actually vegan.
That's amazing. Are they vegan?
They're seitan balls. Yes, they're not actually meatballs at all.
Is the person who runs the
I'm not sure, to be
vegan?
honest. It might have just been a random person on Twitter with a flying spaghetti monster logo, but I'm going to take it.
Yeah, and it's hard to say why exactly that was. I think partly again because I often felt like an outsider to the community. I think I was also better at applying certain like abstract principles and values that we learned in school than maybe some students were. Like one memory that has really stuck with me. This doesn't necessarily like pertain as much to religion or like my metaphysical worldview, but I have this memory of, I think it was maybe like 5th or 6th grade. We were in a Judaic studies class. They were beyond a certain age, all of those classes were gender segregated. So I think it was all just girls, which isn't particularly important to this story. And I just, I remember one of my classmates was talking about some guy. I think he was maybe like a family friend who happened to be Arab American or something. And she said something about him, said something along the lines of, how could I be friends with, how could we be friends with this person? He's an Arab. And that was really upsetting to me. The rest of the class like basically devolved into all of us arguing and crying about it, because I was like, how can you guys not see that that's a racist statement? We're educated, in the US to understand the civil rights movement and the history of racism and what you're like, how are you not able to apply that to, to what you're talking about? And
what was the response in the class? Was it split? Did the teacher have a particular view? I'm just sort of interested in what was that a prevalent view, or was it seen as something?
It's really hard to say. I mean, and I don't want to, I don't want to disparage this community either. But I think that, it was an extremely pro-Israel community. I think it was fair to say that many people had negative and racist views about Arabs and people of Arab descent. And these were all kids also. I don't know to what extent, like I don't know to what extent everything that they believed like reflected what the adults believed. Although if children are thinking that way, that they got it from somewhere, right? But I think the teacher, the teacher in this class happened to be, she was a really great teacher and special person, and she took me aside and she was like, you're obviously right about this, and I'm sorry that things are this way.
Yeah. So you it sounds like whether you count yourself as part of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster or not, you sort of moved away from having that religious worldview or holding it. And was that so for some of my guests, there's more of a sort of evidence and reason and facts, and they sort of look into intellectually and just don't find it a convincing story. They just don't think the evidence is there, or they think about other religions and go, this feels more man-made than divinely inspired. I just don't believe the facts. For others, and you sort of hinted at that challenge there. There are ethics or values that are associated with, maybe not because of the religious way of thinking, but there are ethics and values associated with it that they think that just doesn't feel compassionate or right to me. There's maybe polarization, or there's gender issues or homophobia or whatever it is. And so it can be more of a sort of an ethical thing that draws them away from a religious worldview. Was it one or the other, or a mix of both that led you to sort of?
That's a good question. It's so hard to like put yourself back in,
Yeah.
the headspace that you were in back then. But it was probably both. I had this profound sense of justice from a young age for whatever reason that extended to a lot of issues. It is certainly where my concern for non-human animals came from. I decided to become vegetarian, I believe, when I was 11. And at that time, it was purely out of like a theoretical argument. I just had this thought that if we don't have to kill animals to survive, then if we don't have to eat animals, then it's wrong to do that. Just like I merely like theoretically had that thought,
Yeah.
and I didn't even know anything about the reality of factory farming and what animal agriculture, contemporary animal agriculture today looks like. I don't remember where I had heard of vegetarian before, what kinds of depictions of it I had seen when I was 11, but I think after I made that decision, my mom and I got a book from Barnes and Noble, How to Become a Vegetarian, and that's when it had some like information. I think it said like animals raised for food today are treated really, really badly. And I was like, oh my God. And that just like set me along the path that that I've like been on since then. But the people I went to school with at Jewish school did not understand vegetarianism at all. And of course, they'd say stuff like God gave us dominion over animals and the right to eat them, and even say stuff like animals are happy to be killed and give us sustenance.
Yeah.
I had forgotten that one. And then
A willing
when I was
self-sacrifice, apparently.
yeah, I'd forgotten that one. And yesterday when I was thinking a bit about what I would say in this interview, I kind of remembered it. And I was like, oh my God, people really said that, that animals were happy to be killed for us because it's their God-given purpose. However, when I started high school, so after 8th grade, I started high school. This was in a very different environment. I was no longer going to religious school. It was, I would say, it was fully secular and pretty progressive school. I wouldn't say that people's attitudes towards veganism and animals were particularly different. By then I was vegan, or trying to become vegan. My non-religious peers, they would use different arguments, like talk about animals' lack of intelligence, or that we need them for protein or whatever. But fundamentally, I think these were just as false and fake as saying that torturing and slaughtering billions of animals a year is fine because God said so. So I don't really believe that religion somehow forces people to think a certain way about animals. I really don't. Although I suppose it's undoubtedly true that this idea of human dominionism really undergirds most organized forms of Judeo-Christianity, but I think it undergirds the philosophy of most people with a scientific worldview too. And I think that being educated in a religious setting for many years gave me the ability to see that there are limits to scientific knowledge too, and secular society doesn't have all the answers. I don't know whether it's my Jewish background that helped me see that, or whether it's the fact that I see I see everything through an animal liberation lens. And when you're green-pilled in that way, it's very easy to see the delusion and self-justification that is pervasive across all levels of society and across the most, respected institutions and thinkers.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point in the animal liberation space, but I think you can apply it to most fields of human discrimination and human ethics as well. And that there might be certain things about a supernatural or religious worldview that might be an accelerant, or might give you some particular reasons for driving dangerous ethics in certain areas, but you can quite often, nearly always, find exactly the same things going on in people with a secular or naturalistic worldview as well. They just, use a different flavor of reason to end up at the same point. So, there's many different ways of getting to an anthropocentric worldview that justifies harming non-humans for trivial needs, right? That you can have religious reasons for it, you can have naturalistic reasons for it.
Yeah. And, I guess I should also say I feel I feel a profound connection to all of life on Earth, particularly animals and sentient life. And it's something that I feel I can't really express in material terms. I believe that every animal species has a way of understanding and being in the world that is, important and valuable in itself, and very often transcends what humans are capable of, and probably what we're capable of understanding. Think of how birds can navigate, extraordinarily long distances using magnetism, or how dogs know so much through their incredible sense of smell. Those are like some of the classic examples. And so, I believe that respect for non-human life and epistemological humility should underpin our efforts to understand the world, rather than the assumption that humans have the right to manage and dominate all of life on Earth.
Yeah, completely agree. And as you've demonstrated, this nearly always happens in these conversations. It's so hard to compartmentalize the sort of what's real question from what matters, because there are some people who love this sort of is-ought distinction, and they're completely distinct and you can't link them. And it just doesn't feel right to me. They just seem to, link together in all sorts of different ways. Your understanding of reality and us and other sentient beings, it for me drives the way I think about those things ethically as well. And you've demonstrated that. So, but if we finish up on this sort of what's real question so far, you moved away from a sort of a formalized religious worldview, if you even really held it, but you said, look, that's not for me anymore. It sounds like that process wasn't difficult for you. You didn't feel, social challenges or psychological challenges or emotional challenges from moving away from that. It feels like that was quite a natural thing for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
You didn't feel like you were losing something or giving something up, or?
Yeah. I think that's fair to say. I mean, I definitely still identify as Jewish and and see that as an important part of who I am. You might be familiar with this idea that a lot of Jewish people don't necessarily feel that they have to believe everything to have a to have a connection with the religion, the way that I feel like some Christians I know feel that they do. But
and it seems,
I think it's fair to say.
I think it's true in almost every religion that there's actually, quite a lot of people within those religious communities that don't actually hold the supernatural beliefs. It's a community thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a sense of identification as well. But it certainly seems very prevalent in Jewish communities that, there's a really strong swell of secular thinking and naturalistic thinking, but still a strong identification with being Jewish and being part of that community. So. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't have, I maybe this is already obvious, but I don't have any problem with spirituality at all, or religion, because I think that the way that again, the way that I feel about animals and life can definitely be described as spiritual. But I think that I've been alienated from a lot of things within Judaism, because human dominionism is such a fundamental part of it a lot of the time, and it's just totally and that is totally at odds with my worldview. I don't know if that makes me like a pagan or animist or something.
I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's a fascinating journey, because quite a lot of people I've spoken to have left a formal established religion and moved to, I'm a sort of classic boring full-on naturalistic atheist agnostic, so I've sort of that I'll keep that quite clean. And I also don't really use terms like spiritual or soul or mystical stuff at all. I keep epistemic humility and open-mindedness. All sorts of, almost anything could be real, but I'm choosing not to grant any credence to it until I see evidence. But even within that naturalistic way of thinking, I still think I feel many of the things you're talking about in terms of a sense of connection and a sense of sort of awe and wonder and a sense of, humility about our lack of ability to understand everything as well. But some other people have gone down a more sort of spiritual but not religious route. Other people have maintained a religious cultural identification but have just dropped some of the supernatural beliefs. And for me, the balance I find, or the most important thing for me, is I do think that naturalism is an optimal way, or least bad way we have, of trying to understand a reality. And if we want to make the world better, then understanding reality well is useful. But beyond that, I don't feel any particular need to challenge or, attack a religious or a supernatural or a spiritual worldview. I think they can have an enormous amount of compassion and community and generosity of spirit within them. I think all we do need to do is, as you've implied, let's just focus on the, where harm is being caused. Whether that's because of a naturalistic belief or because of a supernatural belief, in a sense, doesn't really matter. But if it's a belief in anthropocentrism and human dominion, if it's sexism or racism or anti-Semitism or some other form of worldview bigotry, we can just challenge those directly and clearly, almost regardless of whether, what the motivation is and whether it's supernatural or not. So I think that still leaves quite a lot of space for different ways of thinking about reality. But I think we can also be quite firm and clear about where those ways of thinking cause harm to others, humans and non-humans. But
yeah, I feel like I think about this a lot. And I've often heard people make the claim that religion is responsible for all these atrocities, and religion is responsible for the worst violence and discrimination and just the worst stuff that people have done. And I just I really, really don't think that's true.
Yeah.
And
it can certainly be overplayed. And
I think that we can talk about this more, but science is responsible for a lot of evil stuff too. A lot of which I've reported on. Scientific research is fundamental to factory farm, the development of factory farm practices and atrocities. I don't think that there's anything inherent to science or religion or whatever that that makes people ethical or empathetic or
I totally agree. I mean, both have good and bad aspects. Neither are just good or bad. And you're totally right that even a completely naturalistic way of thinking doesn't guarantee any sense of universal compassion necessarily. There are many people who will claim to have a completely naturalistic way of thinking who still have deeply awful ethics. So it's not, it's by no means a guarantee. And in a way, that's partly why I'm trying to stitch the two aspects together in the sentientism idea, because I think naturalism by itself is a good way of understanding the world, but it doesn't tell you anything about ethics necessarily, which is why we also need the sentiocentric compassion. But in the same way, I think if you just have the sentiocentric compassion, compassion for all sentient beings, if you believe things that are really wrong about the world, that can actually lead your ethics astray as well. So I think the combination of the two is important. It's not enough just to have one or the other. But let's move on to that second question, because I to summarize, it feels like you're Jewish and you identify with that community in that way. You don't necessarily hold to these, supernatural beliefs or necessarily all of the practices that some people within that community would, but it's deeply important to you. You've got an epistemic humility about the nature of reality, and you feel an emotional sort of connection with things and a wonder about things that leaves you open to, what reality really is. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, definitely. You're good at listening and summarizing back to people what they're saying.
I've been paying attention. So let's leave that what's real question there. But the second question is just as important, which is what matters and who matters. And in a way, you've already answered at the first part of that question, because you talked about how the concept of justice was intuitively very important to you from an early age. But once you've softened your connection, for example, with Judaism or a religious worldview that has rules in the Bible and the Torah, and there are practices that you follow, and once you say, well, that's not my definition of good and bad necessarily, is often a challenge put to people who've left religion, religious rules to the side, or looking for something else. So what is ethics for you? What is good and bad, and what is right and wrong? And you talked about justice. Is that how you'd answer that question, as to what morality and ethics is grounded in for you? what really matters?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I would say, I don't know if this is too obvious, but I like reject any form of violence against and anyone human or animal, and that's what animal agriculture is. A lot of people who aren't religious and use this, particularly those who are interested in animal ethics. I feel like a lot of people use this idea of in intelligence. Like one thing we hear repeated a lot, for example, is that like pigs have the same intelligence level of intelligence as a 3-year-old human or something like that. And that raises the question, like what is intelligence, right? It's not as though there's a single thing called intelligence that lives in our brains. Like to me, the claim that an animal or like a pig has the level of intelligence as a 3-year-old human makes no sense, because they have different minds. It's not as though there's one dimension of intelligence. And think of all the things that that pigs can do that people can't do. It's not as though you can't drop a 3-year-old person in a herd of wild pigs and have them like assimilate and do all the stuff that those animals do. So I feel like I'm not answering what you asked at all, but the reason I went there is just like I feel like that is arguments like that are used so much to to provide as a justification for why we should care about animals. And I understand why it is, why that might be, why that might be something that's persuasive to someone who hasn't considered animals morally at all before, or just sees them as a totally separate category. But I guess I'm really opposed to this idea that I don't believe that there is this single hierarchy of intelligence with humans at the top, and that or that this like single, it's almost like the great chain of being, and
and we're at the pinnacle, and everything else is beneath us.
I totally reject that. And
it's odd in a way, because in a sense it almost has echoes of some of the religious ways of thinking we were talking about before, because those are, you could argue God is at the at the top of the hierarchy, but then humans are just underneath. We are made in his image, and the dominion ideas flow from that. But again, as you said before, many people with a naturalistic worldview still get into a similar pattern of thinking, where they say, oh, we're more intelligent, we're more evolved, we're the apex predator, and use that to justify exactly the same sort of dominion. It's odd. For me, it comes back to a definition of what morality is about. It almost just as a choice about the definition. And for me, morality is about some form of concern for others. And if it isn't about that, I'm not really sure it's even morality. And once you have a concern for others, I think what we're talking about is a concern for their perspective, their life, their experience, whether they're suffering, whether they're flourishing. And I think that leads, me into a similar place, that it's concern for, avoiding oppression, for a sense of justice and fairness, ultimately driven by, that concern for others. But you've already started to talk about the second question, which is almost as important, which is who gets to matter, because I think almost every human has some form of morality. They care about others in some way, but it's a critical question, who do they care about? Even serial killers care about their love their mothers, that type of thing. But the question is, who else? So that would be another interesting thing to understand your journey from, is how did you start out thinking about moral consideration for other humans and compassion for other humans? You mentioned going vegetarian at 11, and then your journey after that. What was going on in your mind that triggered those first thoughts about justice for humanity, and maybe justice on an even broader scope? And was that a difficult journey for you?
I think that I was able to, I think that I was able to see, I would, think about, I talked about this a bit earlier, but I think about all the things that we would learn, in history about, atrocities and, types of like injustice and oppression that took place in the past. I feel like I was I was just naturally inclined toward seeing stuff that's happening today as parallel to, to those things, and I still do in
Yeah,
a way that
you can see the
other
echoes
people
and feel
don't.
the, yeah.
And it's not, I don't believe that, it's not that I believe that, that we're inevitably marching toward, I don't believe in this doctrine of progress, or that the world will necessarily get better and more just. But when when you can look at a very different society and stuff that they thought, that they thought was perfectly normal, that we now see as evil. I think I'm like, I always thought about things that we're doing today that will be seen the same way.
And was
Yeah,
that,
and I
and do you
talked
think,
about
and
this.
was that sort of analytical thing, you're thinking it through logically, or was there a sense of, an emotional connection where you sort of saw the horror and harm of these things and you felt for the victims, or a bit of both?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think like empathy was a huge part of it. Particularly, excuse me, particularly for non-human animals. After I found out that factory farming was a thing, and I watched Earthlings probably when I was 13 or 14. I didn't know, didn't know what I was getting into, but that
must have been shocking at that age to.
It was awful, and probably traumatic. Some people, I think that most people are horrified when they see stuff like that, but not everyone has the same response to it, or not everyone sees it and thinks like, wow, I need to immediately change the way I eat and my whole, and my whole way of thinking. But I think that was how it impacted me. I don't know whether that's because of having a high sense of empathy or whatever.
It's certainly unusual, unfortunately.
And I talked about this idea of, I don't believe that like intelligence, whatever we mean by that, is an appropriate way to think about what we owe to non-human animals. And I don't, I have it's interesting that you're talking about this question of how can we, to what extent can we separate the questions of what's real and what matters. And as you were saying, that they're so like interconnected for me, because I don't trust, like, I don't really trust humans to come up with a legitimate unbiased like definition of intelligence or whatever other criteria we use to care about animals, that doesn't like illegitimately put us at the top. And I guess that idea that like knowledge is inextricable from power is
And we're so good at doing that. We're so good at doing it. It's like an inbuilt drive in us to construct hierarchies and structures that privilege ourselves. You might say it's understandable in a way, but it's quite insidious. It's not always. Sometimes it's deliberate and constructed that way, and sometimes it's, oh, look how it turned out. We happen to be at the top. Well, isn't that a lucky accident? And I think that skepticism is entirely warranted. And I think you can see that playing out with intrahuman ethics as well. There are all sorts of supposed rationalizations for various forms of intrahuman discrimination too. And I think it's entirely fair to be deeply skeptical of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how they like, morph over time to fit to fit whatever like belief system we think is acceptable today. Like today you still hear some people, say that, I don't want to name any names, but like, legitimate PhD academics who have argued that, well, the poor are, like poor people are intrinsically less intelligent or talented or something like that, because the market rewards like the smartest people, which is like I think like a totally morally bankrupt and intellectually bankrupt idea. Maybe it's more common in the US than abroad. I don't know.
Yeah, there's bits of it everywhere. It's like, oh, I've come up with another reason to justify the way I want to act in the world. It's like, really well done. Yeah. But I think, and you focused on intelligence as one example, which I just don't think work. I just don't see really why it's relevant to morality. It's a capacity to solve problems. I don't really see why it's relevant in terms of thinking who matters in our ethical system. And that's partly why I've been focusing very much on sentience, because it seems to me tied quite closely to an intuitive definition of morality, in that it's just the capacity to suffer and flourish. And morality is, for me, caring about the suffering and flourishing of others. So that's it. It's like ties it in quite closely. But you can see it in related terms as well. So some people will think of sentience and consciousness as the same thing, but other people will build extra stuff into consciousness. So they'll say, well, yes, consciousness includes this sentience, this capacity to suffer and flourish, but it also includes an advanced intelligence or a sapience. It includes an ability to plan for the future. It includes some sort of complex ability to represent the self. So once again, in a sense, humans are more conscious or more special, or, so again, that's why I quite like this idea of just focusing on sentience. It almost comes back to that Jeremy Bentham question of, can they suffer? And if the answer is yes, then they warrant compassion. It's almost that simple.
Yeah. I mean, I think sentience probably is, I was thinking about this before too, but I think that sentience is probably comes like the closest to how I would like explain, who I think matters. I guess I worry about whether we really have the ability to recognize sentience when it's right in front of us, you know what I mean? And so I worry about like imposing a definition or boundaries on it. I think when I was a kid, it was, when I was a kid and first thinking about, eating animals, I thought that farm animals like mattered morally, because it was, it's entirely obvious that pigs and chickens and cows are alive and and have feelings and can have, can feel pain and have desire as much as like cats and dogs do. I don't need like a scientific study to tell me that, but then when we think about like, creatures that we can sympathize with less, that are very different from humans, I think that
fish being a particularly urgent mass scale example.
Yeah, I think I've become much more, sad and empathetic, about what's happening to fish, over the years. But, in cases like that, I think, scientific research can be incredibly helpful. And, and everything that we've learned about like octopuses, this is a tricky thing because like animal research is itself is often very unethical. So how do you do that in order to figure out whether or not an animal deserves like to have the moral status and freedom from suffering when you're like inflicting suffering? Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. And yeah, I mean, that seems insane. It's if you think in a modern sense about if we wanted to understand human suffering, we wouldn't research that by without consent causing humans to suffer a great deal and then trying to work out if they're suffering or not. We'd have some prudence and some other lines of inference there. Our ethics has to drive the way we try and find out knowledge as well. It can't be knowledge at all costs. And I think you hinted at, even with the idea of sentience, it is the closest fit for me as well, just because it seems so tied into this definition of a consideration for others. But there are risks with the idea of sentience because, as you say, you could just declare that a certain type of species or entity isn't sentient when they are. That would be a terrible mistake. You can still create hierarchies within sentience that may or may not be justified as well. You could say, well, humans are more sentient and other animals are less sentient, so maybe that justifies some form of exploitation as well. And there is a wide variety of views amongst people who think of themselves as sentientists about how to handle that, whether you push for a sort of egalitarian approach where every sentient being counts the same, an ant and a human and a chicken and a fish, or whether there are different ways of grading. But I guess the important thing for me has been to leave that as a challenging, interesting question. But the most important thing is to set the boundary of inclusion and just make sure that every sentient being gets included. And what I mean by moral consideration is that at the very least, you wouldn't needlessly harm and kill that being. And then, that's not enough. There's so much more we need to build on top of that, but at least let's make sure we set that inclusion boundary to include every sentient being so that we're not ignoring any suffering. And that would imply we don't exploit, we don't harm, we don't kill, we don't farm, any of the beings in that scope. But there's still risks with it, even with the idea of sentience.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of, erring on the side of being inclusive. I like what one of your past guests talked about, ethical guardrails, and, the idea that there are creatures or life that we may not be sure about, and that's a reason to err on the side of being inclusive. That's what, I think that's kind of what I say when, it's sometimes you get this question about like honey and bees and like, do you really, are you really concerned about the exploitation of bees? And I tend to say that I don't empathize with them as easily as I do, with mammals or birds or fish, but I think it makes sense for them to be included under the umbrella of sentientism or veganism or whatever, and we should err on the side of caution and inclusion.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Thank you. So I think we've answered pretty well, what's really and how to believe, and we've answered, I think, who and what matters, and I think we share this sense that sentience might not be a perfect characteristic. It's certainly fuzzy. There's not really a guaranteed way of knowing 100% one way or the other, but at least as a concept, it seems to at least make sure we're not going to exclude any suffering beings from our consideration as well. But we're in this odd situation where nearly all of the 8 billion people on the planet disagree with one or two of those tenets as well. And it strikes me from many of the conversations I've had that the problems we're facing, human problems and non-human problems and environmental problems, yes, there are technical challenges and there are intellectual challenges that we need to work through, but those aren't the biggest problems. The biggest problems are actually human psychology and human social norms and human political will that are quite often stopping us achieving even the most obvious glaring win-win-wins that are just staring us in the face. And that's a deeply frustrating position to be in. But that sets the context for this final question about the future and how can we make a better world. So you can go anywhere you like in this. You can talk about sort of Star Trek utopian visions of the future. You can talk about the pragmatics of driving change when it comes to human ethical topics or non-human ethical topics. And given your work, I'm also very interested about the role you see of the public media and journalism and the press in shaping human attitudes and driving change. So it's another crazily big question, but you can go where you like on how to make a better world.
Yeah, it's hard to have much hope, isn't it? It can be hard to explain to people, like, I think people understand why factory farming is bad, right? Because the violence and the suffering is so obvious and profound. I think it can be harder to talk about, why what people think of as like small or humane or family farms, aren't okay. Even if they, even if they understand that the process of like slaughter and killing it itself is horrific, I think a lot of people, people have that like one bad day idea, and they're like, that seems fine. That seems worth it to me. If the animal otherwise has an okay life, something that I've struggled to explain is, but that I think should be like obvious and want to find a better way to talk about is the idea that it like commodification, commodification of animals is the problem, and will always lead to abuse. I don't mean that it'll necessarily result in violence and abuse in every single case, but it will, if you have a system of commodification of animals, there will be widespread abuse. I think progressives and people on the left are very good at understanding that when you give someone absolute power, like ownership over someone else, that's an untenable situation. It'll result in abuse. It means that the powerless like parties' interests aren't heard or even like recognized as such. I think
because they're seen as a, you know, a product or a source of money or value that isn't related to their own experience. It's not about them as a end in themselves. It's, you know, they're just a cog in a machine or a product or a process.
Yeah,
and there's a
that's
power
good way of
relationship
putting it.
there, and, you know, a potential for exploitation at least.
Yeah, you know, that's a good way of putting it. You know, and with farm animals, because they're raised for they're raised for food, right? And that, I think the way that they are, you know, I think their role in our food system or in society is better seen as like machines for you know, they're like treated as, you know, machines for making products rather than living creatures, and they're bred and optimized for you know, for production in a way that has nothing to do with their comfort or interests. Or so, but that all of that is just to say that, like, you know, commodification of animals is you know, is totally untenable. And you know, in my like utopian ideal world, you know, we wouldn't have that. It's not like it's not just the industrialization of animal agriculture per se that you know, but the like I think the core problem is, you know, like commodification of creatures that should be, you know, persons with rights. I feel like this leads naturally into this question of how do you change the world? How do you change people's minds? I asked, you know, recently I asked this question on Twitter. What would you say to, you know, in a presentation to high school students about factory farming, which I'm going to be speaking to a group of high school students about factory farming soon, and have been, you know, thinking about how do you even begin to approach that. Anyway, some people responded, you know, there were a few responses saying, like, don't use the term factory farming at all, because that sets up this false dichotomy between large scale animal agriculture and, you know, what people think of as like a humane or idyllic form of animal agriculture that never actually existed. I totally understand that argument. I also think that people's minds don't work like perfect rational proofs, right? And if you like confront people, especially like a group of 15 or 16-year-olds with this, you know, high level idea about why all animal agriculture commodification is unjust. I think that that can be a lot for people to you know, to take in all at once. And it's hard for me to think back to, you know, how exactly my like ethical journey unfolded, but it probably, you know, I probably went from, despite the fact that I decided to be vegetarian before I even knew factory farming, I still think that, you know, confronting the horror of factory farming first, and then like thinking backward to, you know, to the idea of like what, you know, commodification actually means and what implications that has for all use of animals, is, I feel like that's how it works for some people. And I think that we should have a pluralist, you know, like a pluralistic approach to what's going to work and to change people's minds. You know what I mean? I think it makes me sad to see people in the animal movement fighting about this stuff. You know, because division is just going to weaken it, and we need many theories of change. I think, you know, I think direct action is essential, which I've written about. Direct action meaning, you know, activists who go, you know, who go to places where animals are being exploited and abused, and documenting it or filming it, and, you know, showing it to the rest of the world. I think that is absolutely essential. And getting, you know, animal industries have all sorts of narratives about what they're doing and why it's humane that is totally just totally at odds with reality. And it's really important to have people in the movement who are like getting close to what is actually happening. There's been a lot of, there's been a ton of like undercover footage over the years, and you might think like, well, what is the point of having even more of this? Like, don't we have more than enough about how horrific the system is? And that's true, but I also think that the industry claims that it's like reforming itself or moving on from stuff that has been documented in the past, that it'll claim that it's changing stuff, that it's not using gestation crates anymore or whatever, and actually be lying about it. And I think it's important to always have like current documentation.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
of what's going on.
And their machine is so well practiced at, or that was in the old days, that was just some bad actors. We've improved now, things are different. They're so practiced at the PR and the marketing. And I think you're right. It's almost like the raw material of just reminding people of the moral urgency of what's happening every minute of every day. And some of my previous guests have just talked almost about the ethical responsibility of bearing witness and showing what's going on. So I agree, that's an important part. And I like the way you talked about a various range of different concepts, because I think certain angles of conversation are effective with different people. So for some people, there is this sort of empathic, imagine what it would be like for your companion animal to be in this situation. It's like an empathic connection. For other people, as you say, maybe particularly people with a progressive politics or on the left, should already identify with justice and exploitation and commodification and these concepts in the human realm, and transplanting those to think, we're doing this to non-humans as well. So I think depending on the worldview of the people we're communicating with, different concepts and different ideas can sort of pluck at them and push them in different ways. And I think you're right. We need a sort of pluralistic approach, because we've got to reach such a diversity of people. We can't just use one track, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not everyone is going to as we know, not everyone is going to be changed when they see how horrific the system is. And so, what do you do besides that? That's the question I think that everyone is, like everyone in the animal movement really struggles with. I mean, it's hard to say. I think just in my own life, I think when I was in high school and going vegan and really passionate about it, I would always like bake vegan cupcakes from the book Vegan Cupcakes Take Over the World, which is an incredible book. And I would bring them to school for everyone. And I think having that positive, positive vision and example of what like being plant-based or vegan is really like, can be more influential than just confronting people with horrors and negativity, because food is so intimate and and personal, and people associated with their childhood, and it's people really don't want to think about that in terms of like violence and injustice, and I think like providing a positive vision of an alternative and showing people that it's doable has been, I think it's been more effective in my own life than just like than just reminding people how bad everything is. If people start to eat animals less, whether it's for climate reasons or health reasons or whatever, or because like maybe some like plant-based alternatives like Impossible Meat or whatever become more viable, I think merely eating animals less can't, takes away the need for people to invent justifications for doing it. You know what I mean? I think behavior change can precede precede values or ideological change. And I guess that's kind of what I meant by, people's minds definitely don't just work like irrational proofs. And I understand the temptation to say that, to want to present the arguments against eating animals like purely and and consistently, but it may not be the most effective.
And I think the resolution for me is, and I think this applies to what you're saying about factory farming versus, non-factory farming or supposedly humane farming as well, is that I think you're right that we need a pluralistic approach that will resonate with lots of different people in lots of different ways. There need to be positive aspects to the vision as well as challenging the horror of what's going on. And I absolutely agree that as people change their behavior, that will free them to have, put their better ethics into practice as well. Because quite often it's hard to condemn something you're complicit in, but once you've removed yourself from it to some degree, it can enable you to upgrade your ethics. But I think the important thing, and this is where some of the nervousness comes from, is that we still need to keep that strong ethical drive pushing forward behind all of that thinking, so that we don't end up in some sort of dead end where factory farming has just been rebranded and consumers have kidded themselves that, I don't buy from factory farms anyway, and nothing's really changed. So I think that ethical purity is important in the backdrop, but it doesn't have to be the only message. And you can see that, I think, in lots of human ethics as well, where sometimes the desire to be pure and clear and never compromise undermines your ability to actually get power and make change. And ultimately, I think sometimes you need to sort of put that ethical purity and power in the back of your mind and take a more pluralistic approach in the campaign.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. And as for this question about the role of like journalism and all this, obviously, I think that it's, I think that it's essential to have reporting on what the industry is doing, and also what, academics and researchers in service of the industry are doing, and every part of it. I have wondered whether, how much the industry really cares about having so many negative stories out there. For example, bird flu is happening right now, and there has been so much incredible coverage of the horrors taking place as poultry birds are being exterminated due to
your piece in The Intercept was mind-blowing.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess so. So listeners are aware, the really, really short summary is, millions of chickens and turkeys and other farmed birds are being exterminated due to bird flu right now. There are a few different methods that are being used, but one that is on the rise is called ventilation shutdown, where the birds are basically killed by, via heat stroke through extremely high temperatures. It's a horrible way to die. It's been called, being roasted or cooked to death. It's also been used in the pork industry a few years ago. Anyway, I think that, of course, I think it's critical to constantly have to constantly be on top of and investigating what the industry is doing. I've also wondered how much they really care about having so many negative headlines, because I think they, it's not as though, at least in the United States, I don't really think that, I don't really think that people are ceasing to buy their products very much. And I think after, a few decades of investigations and, and media reporting on how bad the industry is, I think maybe they figured out that it doesn't really matter as long as people don't stop buying their stuff, which is really cynical. And I hope that's not true. And it doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean that having reporting can't matter in other ways, by, applying reporting on ventilation shutdown can, apply some measure of pressure on, organizations that condone it, like the American Veterinary Medical Association, to stop doing that, to stop, I think, publicly, naming people who have been involved in horrific meat industry stuff. Kenneth Anderson, he's a professor at North Carolina State University who led research on ventilation shutdown experiments that I reported on, that laid the foundation for the industry's use of ventilation shutdown. I think naming people like that could apply some amount of shame, or sense that maybe what they're doing is wrong, or make them question what side of history they're on here. But it's hard to say also, because we're in such a polarized time also, where media that I think of as high quality and legitimate doesn't necessarily speak to vast swaths of the country that think it's like fake news or, or biased or unreliable.
Yeah.
And
And I
that's like a
think
huge.
And I think there's enormous power in the type of journalism you do, because it does hit these issues hard, and it might feel frustrating that it doesn't have an immediate, sea change response in the public mood. But I think it does progressively make a difference over time. The other thing I'd love to see is mainstream, media, much of whom you write for, adopting your frame of mind when you're writing, because there's anthropocentrism embedded into even the editorial standards of most of these publications, whereas at least even if they acknowledge the existence of victims in animal agriculture whenever they write about it, instead of, as you say, products or commodities, even that could have a subtle but quite deep shift on the public mood. So.
Yeah, oh my God, don't even get me started on everything wrong with how with how media writes about animals. That could be another interview.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. I think we've answered what's real, what matters, and talked about the future and its challenges. So what's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, reading your writing?
Oh, yeah. A lot of my work is on my website, which is on marinabolotnikova.com. My name is hard to spell, but you can look at the spelling in the podcast description. And on Twitter, I'm M.Bolotnikova.
That's brilliant. Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. It's difficult to say whether I enjoy your writing, because you write about some really difficult subjects, but it's super powerful and deeply important and insightful and compassionate. So thank you for that. Long may it continue. And it's been a pleasure to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.